welcome back. So I've got a new story today, one I haven't told before. This is Tristan and the Morholt, or a story that I'm calling Tristan and the Morholt, which is kind of like a Cornish David and Goliath kind of story. This is part of a larger story that you've probably heard of called Tristan and Iseult, which is of a sort of courtly medieval romance genre. It's a bit like a British Romeo and Juliet story, but it's based on an old Celtic folktale that is now lost to history. So there's lots of versions of this. But right here, I'm going to tell a piece of it called Tristan and the Morholt. It was long ago. The Romans had left Britain and the whole island was on fire, invaded from the west by the Irish, from the east by the Saxons, who were marauding across the country, setting fire to everything in their wake. The Picts were coming down from the north, and all of the Celtic kingdom of Britannia was splintered off into many different kingdoms. Some of them fighting each other, some of them fighting the Saxons. Nothing was good. One of these kingdoms, one of the last kingdoms remaining, was the kingdom of Dumnonia, that is in modern-day Cornwall and Devon. And the king of this kingdom was a man called King Mark, and he was a great king. Now, across the sea from Cornwall was another Celtic kingdom in modern-day France called Brittany. In this time it was sometimes called Lyonesse. And here there was a boy standing on a beach, looking across the sea to the island of Britain. And he didn't know it, but Britain was his home. This boy's name was Tristan. This was one of those people that comes along every once in a while, like they've fallen from the sky. He was a genius, a polymath. He could play the harp just like a ringing a bell. And he was trained by his father, who was the steward of Lyonesse, so servant to the king, and he was looking after the kingdom. So this boy, Tristan, was brought up just like an aristocrat, just like a prince, and trained in all the martial arts, trained in the harp, trained in courtly poetry, all of these things, how to hunt, how to dress an animal, all of these things Tristan had. And he excelled in all of them. But the thing he liked most of all was just to stand at the water's edge and sing across the water. And he did this a lot. So he was doing that one day when he spied sails coming over the horizon. Painted sails grew larger and larger until it resolved itself into a ship with a dragon-headed prow. Northmen were coming, traders possibly. And they sailed up into the bay, and on that ship were all sorts of wonderful things. There were furs from the far north, there were hunting birds, there were games of chess, rare chess pieces carved out of ivory, there were spices, herbs, all sorts of wondrous things. And Tristan, having the confidence of his aristocratic birth and upbringing, just walked on board this ship and played a few games of chess. He beat everyone. He beat Sigurd and Ragnar and Uthric and Eric the Red. He beat them all. And then he started to sing and play the harp. And it was so beautiful that those Northmen, what we might later call Vikings, they didn't do any trading with that castle. They just pulled up anchor and sailed off. They stole Tristan. He was snatched by pirates from the beach of his father's castle. By the time his father and the court noticed that he had gone, he was far over the sea, and this was the beginning of Tristan's great adventure. Always born over the sea is Tristan. There's some sort of connection with the sea, with Tristan, that we'll see in this tale. Anyway, as far as those pirates were concerned, stealing the lad was a bad idea, and they knew it. They were just a part of this story, because the storms came in, the clouds darkened, Woden and Thunder, they were angry, and lightning rang in the sky, the waves, slate grey waves going higher and higher. "Oh God, oh my various gods," said this Northman, and they summoned the rune man on that ship and threw the knuckle bones and runes onto the deck of the ship, and the signs were clear. Leave the boy. Don't kill him. Don't sell him. For God's sake, don't him. Just put him overboard right now in a little boat. Don't even take him back to his father's castle. Just abandon him in a little boat. So that's exactly what they did. They heaved the boy into a ship and put him down on the waves, and as soon as that little boat touched the water, boom, that sea became still, like glass. The sky cleared, and the clouds cleared away from the sun. Tweet, 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 tweet. It was just like that. Divine intervention. So, the Vikings, their part in this story, done, sailed off, right into another story. Tristan was left in a little boat on a flat glass sea. And he sort of drifted. He didn't know where he was, just somewhere in the English Channel, maybe, I don't know, maybe in the Irish Sea, who knows, the story doesn't tell us. He just floated for a long time and he drifted in and out of consciousness. And during this time he had a dream. He had a dream that he was another boy, long ago, stolen from another beach. It was like him, but different. He had olive-coloured skin, and the sea was bluer, and so was the sky, somewhere in the Aegean, maybe. This time, he was stolen by pirates, but he knew that he was some sort of divine child. He knew that he was a god. He could feel the divine within him. And using his divine magic, the sea, the ship filled up with wine and ivy, and a vine tree grew up the mast, and all of the pirates turned into dolphins and swam away. And Tristan himself, in the boy in the stream, turned into a lion and tore apart those that remained. And then Tristan, who, as you may have noticed, was dreaming of the god Dionysus, awoke. So, something of the divine in Tristan there, something of the wine god, the trickster god, the god of ecstasy. This is very, very important when we think about Tristan running through this story. Anyway, Tristan awoke, and ahoy, there was land. There was a great, great forest and a rocky shore, and he just, like he was guided by the hand of some god, guided into a little inlet in that bay, and there he could see figures, two figures, just on the shoreline, beckoning him in. And as he got closer, he saw these were strangely dressed men, druids, we might call them. They were all painted blue in woad and seashell on their tunics, their hair long and silver torques around their necks. Strange, almost spirits of this island. And this island was Britannia. And Tristan knew that because these guardians of the Isle spoke a language that he knew, British. That's Welsh to you and me. And as Tristan just got out of that boat and coughed and spluttered onto the shoreline, barely alive, these priests, these spirits of the island just blessed him, and then parted and melted away into the dark forests of Britannia. And then something else happened. A hunting horn broke the almost ritualistic silence, and a glorious stag burst out of that forest and charged towards Tristan, foaming at the mouth, spears and arrows stuck in its flank, and then it uttered its last gasp and collapsed right at Tristan's feet. And running in a frenzy, a mad, hunt-crazed, blood-covered lunacy out of that forest were hunters, also painted in woad, with their spears, their hunting gear, their furs, some of them on horses, and they marched right up to Tristan, ignoring him pretty much, and were just about to hack that beast apart. And then Tristan, something in him had to speak, because they were gonna cut the head right off this stag. No. That's not how you properly dismember an animal of this nobility. And he spoke. He could hear his own words echoing in his head, the accent, the French version of British. And they stopped and they listened, and these were dark, heavy men. They were brutal men. You know, they could have chopped Tristan in half there and then, but they didn't. They listened. You know, who was this boy that spoke with such confidence and authority about dressing an animal? They were hunters. Just give me 10 minutes, said Tristan. And he worked quickly. He borrowed one of their hunting knives and he cut that skin in such a way that the head wasn't separated from the rest of the skin. It was just a real work of art. Very deftly he worked. The British hunters, they'd never seen anything like this, and they were overjoyed, and they bore that boy aloft on their shoulders and carried that stag on their stick back to where they'd come from, which was the castle of Tintagel. Tintagel, an amazing place, a nexus, a little locality of culture in the Celtic world. When all the rest of Britain was on fire because of the Saxons, Tintagel was a place for hunting, for art, for love. It was like a gift. So Tristan was born like a hero into that place, under the boughs, through into the courtyards, and he was brought right before King Mark. Now, King Mark looked at Tristan like no king had ever really looked at him before. He looked at him like he was really interested in him. That was King Mark's gift. He was interested in everyone. He's a bit like King Arthur as well, who was probably ruling somewhere else in Britain at this time. He had a real personal touch. Not a lot of leaders have that. And he was intensely fascinated in this young boy from over the sea, from Lyonesse, that had blown into his kingdom. And he was even more interested that his men had learned something new. Tristan got out his harp then borrowed a harp off one of the other courtiers, and the music that poured out of that harp, it was like nothing that had ever been heard in Tintagel before. They were all spellbound, and Mark there and then asked Tristan to be his own personal musician. That was quite an honour. And Tristan really glowed in the presence of this King Mark. It was almost like he was a friendly uncle. That's exactly what he was. Mark was Tristan's uncle. But that, I think, is part of another story. Mark really took Tristan under his wing. In fact, most of the court really took Tristan under his wing, and he was shown the best hunting grounds. And Tristan, for his part, over the next couple of years, really grew to love his adopted country. It wasn't all smiles. There were some barons in the court that didn't like Tristan so much, but most of that was forgotten. You see, after Tristan had been in Tintagel for a while, a dark shadow began to fall over the place. The Irish were coming back. You see, there was a bit of background here. The Cornish and the Irish had been at war, at each other's throats for years. And let me tell you, the Irish had won decisively. The Irish had a champion, the Morholt. He was a giant of a man, a monster of a man. He was a hurricane, a beast of a man. He had splattered hundreds of Cornishmen into bone and mush on the battlefields of Cornwall. He had slayed entire armies single-handedly. The Cornish had no champion to stand up to the Morholt. So regrettably, King Mark had surrendered to the Irish terms. This was years before. Now, every few years, the Irish would come with the champion, the Morholt, and take whatever they wanted. All of the Cornish tin, all of the Cornish clotted cream, all of the Cornish pasties, and all of their slaves, or their young men and women that the Irish would take as slaves to be their serfs to work the land. I think 300 every time they came. Well, that dark day was drawing near. And sure enough, the ships with dark sails appeared on the horizon, and the Irish retinue appeared, and at their head, sure enough, was the Morholt. This is the Goliath of a man that I spoke of. So, among Celtic kingdoms, there's a certain warrior spirit, a certain code of honour that happens. It's the code of honour of the single champion. The Romans didn't do this so much. It's kind of why they did so well in Celtic Britain. But the idea is you get one champion, I get my champion, you get your champion. They beat the out of each other, and whoever wins, wins. That means no one else has to die. And this offer still stands, but the Irish were pretty confident that no one could beat the Morholt. So when the Morholt strode cockily into Tintagel, he says, King Mark, do you have a champion for me this time? What about you? What about you, barons? What about you? What about all these brave knights? Everyone went eerily silent. It was a day of great shame. But Tristan, don't know why he said it. He didn't know why he said it, but some trickster element in him just spoke for him. He said, I'll be the champion. Mark was like, no, my boy. But Tristan said, I'll do it. I'll fight this guy. Oh, look at you, wee lad. Yeah, give him a little pat on the head. But Tristan, he was adamant. And he picked the place and the time of the battle. It'd be tomorrow morning at dawn, and it would be at a little bay just round the corner from Tintagel. Tristan was pretty handy with his sword. He had been well trained. He was quick. He was nimble. But he couldn't really... he wasn't really much compared to the Morholt, this giant of a man. But Tristan, he could think clearly when he was near the sea, so he thought he'd have his best chance with the waves lapping up nearby him. So they both took their ships. Tristan took one ship and the Morholt took another, and the Morholt sailed first around to the island and Tristan followed. And when he arrived, he stepped off his little boat, nodded at the Morholt, and then he did something very odd. He burnt his ship, set fire to it. Odd thing to do, said the Morholt quizzically. Well, Tristan said this, only one of us is going back alive, and I'm taking your ship. Bit of a power move, that we might call. And then he walked straight up to the Morholt, slapped him in the face, and spat at him. Well, I think it's safe to say that the Morholt pretty much beat the out of Tristan. He didn't even draw his sword. He just slapped him to the ground, kicked him, just beat him. Every time Tristan tried to draw his sword, the Morholt just put his hand back in and just whacked him again, just beating him black and blue. He was toying with him, like a cat might just toy with a mouse before it finally crunches it. Tristan was being beaten senseless, and he knew it. He knew he was a dead man. He had one chance. Just as the Morholt went to finish him off, the Morholt drew his sword and was just about to cut Tristan in two pieces. And Tristan rolled out of the way. There's a little fight left in you, my boy. And Tristan rolled until he was just in the water. The waves were rolling over him. And then he could feel something. He remembered that dream. He remembered that dream of when he was that other boy, that god, and he turned into a lion, when he filled that boat with wine and all the sailors just fled like dolphins into the waves. And something rose up in him. A great wave crested over, and Tristan felt some force rise up in him. And when the Morholt went to swing again, Tristan simply wasn't there. And then Tristan ran up the Morholt, sword up his arm, and then drove his own sword right through the Morholt's skull. And then he collapsed. The Morholt had, however, just managed to take a little nick out of Tristan's thigh with the tip of his blade. Tristan, suddenly all the fatigue of battle just dropped off him, and he cut off the Morholt's head and pulled his own sword out of it, pouring blood. And then he took the Morholt's own ship and sailed back round the bay to Tintagel. The Irish and the Cornish were waiting anxiously. And as the Morholt's ship with black sails began to appear, the Irish began to titter and jeer themselves. But then they saw, as the ship came closer and closer, there was a figure in that ship. It was too small to be the Morholt, and it was holding something in its hand. And as that ship got closer and closer, it was clear Tristan had won the day. And the Irish were remarkably silent. And Tristan walked up the steps to Tintagel, up on the edges of the cliff where all the Cornishmen and the Irishmen were assembled, and he just chucked the Morholt's head onto the ground and said, "Get the hell out of my country. And they did, and they never came back. Tristan, meanwhile, went up to his beloved, dear uncle, his foster father, Mark, his king, and hugged him. And Mark just sobbed into his arms, and Tristan felt the life force ebbing out of him. It was from that wound, and he just had time to utter one word into Mark's ears. Poison. Well, Mark did everything he could to save his beloved nephew. But that poison, it was Irish magic, Irish herb magic. The Cornish were terrified of Irish magic, great witchcraft in Ireland. Cornwall, well, this was a newly Christian country and they didn't much go in for witchcraft anymore, but Mark didn't care about that. There was no priest, no peddler, no cunning woman, no druid that Mark did not call into his court to offer prayers, spells, charms, balms, ointments over Tristan's body. But nothing was any use. In the end, the stench of death began to emanate from Tristan's body, and Mark knew there was nothing else for it. There was one peddler, one healer. Even though he could not do anything for Tristan, he knew the only thing left to be done was this. He must put the boy in a little coracle, a little flat-bottomed boat with no oar, just give him his harp and push him off into the sea. Let the gods take care of him now. So with great sorrow, that's exactly what Mark did. And let me tell you, it was like a funeral pyre. They knew they were never going to see the boy again. Well, Tristan drifted off, crossed the Irish Sea, drifting in and out of consciousness, sometimes playing his harp if he had the energy, which he sometimes did because the sea air did slightly revive him, but it wasn't enough. He drifted away into a fog, and then he had a dream. In the dream, he saw golden hair, like sunlight, falling down like a curtain around his face. And then he opened his eyes, and he realized it wasn't a dream. He was in the chamber of a young woman with golden hair falling down around him, and she was tending his wounds. And then he heard her accent, Irish. He had drifted all the way to Ireland and was now being tended by fair Iseult. And that's where we're going to leave this portion of the story. Next will be Tristan and Iseult proper. Thank you very much. That was very rough. Thank you for bearing with me. If I do put this online, which I haven't decided whether I'm going to or not, this is kind of a work in progress. So I'm working with my very talented musician girlfriend here. We're working on a long-form Tristan and Iseult, which we're going to take around Britain and Ireland this summer. So I will post more updates about that and probably a better version of this story. Thank you very much for watching.